welcome to a lecture on antebellum reform in the United States. And we're looking here at a picture of a camp meeting. It's a religious camp meeting, and this is where this age of reform, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, where this all begins. And it's known as the Second Great Awakening. What you have there on the stage is you have an evangelical preacher. Now, an evangelical is Protestant Christianity. It's a very emotional style of speaking. It's almost done in an entertaining way. And the audience is also very active participants and very emotional as well. As you can see, if you look at the audience, they're swooning and leaning on each other. Some have their head down, some are crying out. So these meetings, very emotional. Now, what sort of is or was the Second Great Awakening? It is a generation-long, really fervent social movement of intense religious thinking and a spread of the religion in the 1820s and 1830s. And if you recall, there was an earlier, just before the American Revolution, there was another sort of Great Awakening. And what we mean is like a spiritual awakening, an awakening of your soul, of your heart to God. And this was preceded, by generations of Americans sort of embracing these very sort of scientific and logical Enlightenment ideas of reason instead of emotion. And for a lot of Americans had taken that to a step of not really being all that active religiously, not necessarily believing or attending church, and it's just not really part of your life. But the Second Great Awakening is sort of like a return back to an idea of a fervent religious life. And the message that was being taught was quite different from earlier messages in the church. Early American Protestant thinking very much went on the ideas of John Calvin, which is that God has predetermined who is going to heaven and who is going to hell, and it's not within you to make that decision. Now the message that is being taught is you're not born evil. And you can do good and go to heaven. If you behave immorally, then you'll go to hell. But it's up to you. And it's a very good message. And it's a message that, hey, I'm in control. I'm in control of my life. If I be a good Christian, moral person, then I will ascend up into heaven. And this message of doing good then is going to sort of be picked up as of one of not just being good for myself and being a good person, but actively trying to improve society and reform the sins of society. So how the message would be sent out is in a revival camp. It's very much along the frontier and in the smaller towns away from the bigger communities. And there would be traveling groups of preachers. They're known as itinerant because they travel. They have an itinerary. And they would set up a camp, and it would attract people from all around, the settlers and frontiers people and others, for a week of evangelical preaching, as we saw in that first picture. Emotional, frenzy-styled, very much a form of entertainment. These are people who have, no TV, no entertainment. And so that's part of the appeal to all of it. And many people there would be converted and baptized and as he said, saved. And now you can move forward in your life as a good Christian. And Americans are sort of taught, we're God's chosen people, and we have this ability to build a heaven on earth and through improving society as a whole. The most famous preacher, Charles Finney, and mostly he's preaching in upstate New York along the Erie Canal and those communities that are popping up along there. And it was known as the burned over district because it had been burned with a religious fever. The effects of all of it, more attending church, growth of other Protestant churches, sort of people leaving the established churches into some smaller churches. More women in church, and we're going to see they're going to be leading the charge of reform, as you say right there. And more regional religion, with the frontier and the West being much more of this emotional style than the East, which is much more of a urbane, sophisticated style of Christianity. So let's look at the reform that came out of this. And from this point on, we're going to see reform as an important concept. Social reform, trying to improve society. And generally, it's often trying to get your legislatures, whether at the state level or at the national level, to enact laws to improve conditions or to help and assist people. And here's where we start to get the notion of the split of, a big government that's very active and a small government that's, low taxes, doesn't really have a lot of rules and regulations. And by big, we mean, lots of rules and regulations and being involved. And today we might put the terms liberal and conservative, but at that time they would not use these kinds of labels. And so let's look at the entire American history, up to including today, these waves of reform, as we might call them. So reform is often a reaction to social changes, and government's very slow often to react. And so these reform movements sort of reflect, people recognizing that we need, a new way of doing things. And so we'll put these ways, and we'll put liberalism, reform on one side, and conservatives, and not really being involved and active on the other side. And we'll see, market revolution leading to reforms, and post-Civil War, railroads, oil, steel, and electricity revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, leading to a period known as the Progressive Era in the early 20th century. And followed by a return back to laissez-faire, hands-off style of the 1920s, which ended with the stock market crash of 1929, which led to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal of the 1930s. Post-World War II, quite prosperous, but we're going to have another reform movement in the 1960s. John F. Kennedy, and then his next in line, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And a reaction to that, going against that, was Ronald Reagan in 1980. And we're sort of there now today with this one. So waves back and forth between, big government, small government, and reactions to things. The Progressive Era, very much a reaction to the Second Industrial Revolution. Okay, but now we're going to look more specifically at this antebellum reform of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And one way it started off was public education. And the idea that, kids should go to school and receive an education. So it was very rare before. There was no public school. In some places, yeah, but most places in the United States, no. So up in Massachusetts, a little bit more respect for it. The Northwest Ordinance had set aside a little bit of land for a school, but not many people taking it, and especially in the lower classes, no. Wealthy classes, yeah, you got the option of private education, tutors, these kind of thing. And wealthy might ask, why should we have to, through taxation, support the education of others? Well, I've got a quite simple answer to this. I don't want to be in a society of stupid people, and especially stupid people who can vote. So that was an impetus for it, a reason why we should have public education. Okay, so we're going to go from the before religious education, some of the Catholic schools setting up, and Sunday school, or a private schooling, now to what we call common schools, or a public school. And the idea of, if suffrage is expanding, then people need to be informed at least a little bit better. There's that idea as well. And also the idea of, we're getting these immigrants coming in, we want to turn them into Americans. We don't want their culture. If you're going to come over, you got to act American. And so it's seen schools can be a place where immigrant cultures can be wiped out. And it's quite true, actually, that this happens. When immigrants come, parents often cling to their culture, but the kids, they want to fit in, and they want to lose their accent, they want to lose their funny surname, and assimilate into greater American society. And early schools, especially rural ones, tended to be one room, one teacher, and many different grades. Teachers didn't really have a lot of respect and pay. That's what I like today. And the lessons very much are kept simple. Teach them to read, teach them to write, and math, what are known as the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And this is what an early school might have looked like. Now, some early, if school's now sort of a new thing and a profession, we've got some leaders in here, Horace Mann, Noah Webster, and a guy called McGuffey. Horace Mann especially. He was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and he was campaigning for, more professionalism in schools. And you can't just give anybody, and say they're a teacher. Teachers should be trained in new ideas of teaching and how people learn. And you should have a much better planned curriculum. And we should maybe pay our teachers a little bit better and try to attract better people. Noah Webster, textbooks, and you might have heard of Webster's Dictionary, and he very much standardized American English. And McGuffey, his readers, very simple, readers, and often the lessons in them had stories of morality or love of country, these kinds of things. And they're very common for a long time, and you can see the number that were sold, quite a lot of those made. Okay, outside of education, it's women who are leading the charge of reform, and especially white middle-aged women, and church would be a very important aspect for them, and out of that they're getting the message of do good, and they want to do what they consider do good. And coming out of the Second Great Awakening, and they want to perfect American society and free it from what they would see are the sins, and things like gambling, slavery, alcohol, these kinds of things. Prison should not be about punishment. Prison should be about fixing broken people. And here's where you get different names for prisons. A reformatory, a place where you reform it, or a house of correction. You're going to correct this person, or a penitentiary, which comes from penitence or forgiveness. And a lot of people in prison were actually what we would today call mentally ill, schizophrenic, for example. But back then, they would see somebody, who with Down syndrome or schizophrenia as being insane and really not human, a perverse beast, as you were called it there. And many of these people, who today, just need help and assistance, or just maybe just an understanding, they were locked away as criminals, and often with really cruel and sadistic guards around them. And they built, the places that they would house them would be these sort of foreboding, big, ugly buildings. This is a prison where it's thought, one way to correct them is to get rid of their idleness, so they're just forced to do this exercise and turn that wheel all day long. And Dorothea Dix was a leading reformer to change prisons, especially prisons for mentally ill. And she visited a number of them and then observed what she saw, and then pleaded to legislatures to change. And one example of something she saw is this: what's called the Utica crib, which is, it's just put them in there, a place to restrain a mentally ill person. And she just saw, that they're just housed in filth with no respect, often cruelly punished, and she wanted to change this and fix this. Alcohol was also a big concern for these reformers. And the problem is drinking was very much embedded in American culture and in the immigrants' culture as well. You can see they drank 3 times as much as they do today, and it would lead, of course, to a lot of problems coming from that. And often the victims of this would be the family, the wife and the kids. And so the solution to it is what they called temperance, that you will temper yourself by not drinking. So this word, we'll see this word quite a bit now, temperance. And to be temperate is to not drink. So an organization is put up to help get out the message, encouraging people to not, and many signed what's called a temperance pledge, a promise to never drink again. Abraham Lincoln took a temperance pledge. Lots of getting the message out, lectures. Often these lectures would include somebody who had been a serious drinker who's now changed, and telling his story. And some places enacted laws banning alcohol, which were largely ignored. There's a family, he's taken the temperance pledge and some of the propaganda. We'll have a look at this in class, but it's showing sort of the steps to drunkenness, starting off with step 1, where you are just a drink, and by step 9, you are dead. And under the bridge, the suffering wife and child. Mark Twain said about prohibition, prohibition meaning the banning of something. He's very critical of these reformers. He thinks that they're just going to fail. He says, "Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. Fanatics will never learn that, though it be written in letters of gold across the sky. It is the prohibition that makes anything precious." And as Mark Twain is sort of saying, if you make something illegal, then people are going to want to do it. And you want to get somebody to do something, tell him he can't. And so prohibition often backfires. And we're seeing this with drugs in the United States today and other places. Just a realization that banning it altogether doesn't rarely solve anything. All right. Thank you very much.